Imagine for a second if your landlord charged you a monthly fee every single time you took a breath in your own living room.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that would be, I mean, you'd pack your bags immediately, right?
Exactly. You'd call it extortion, you'd break the lease, and you'd get out. But if you really stop and think about it, that is exactly how our modern digital lives are structured right now, especially, when it comes to software and content creation.
Yeah, 100%. It's like you're the one doing all the heavy lifting.
Right. You create the value, you build the audience, you sit there and record the audio, you write the actual code, and yet you pay this recurring monthly toll just to exist on somebody else's platform. So, welcome to Session Zero. Our deep dive today is not just about a new piece of technology or some clever little coding script. It's really about a fundamental shift in how we navigate digital reality.
Yeah, it's a total paradigm shift.
It really is. We have a massive stack of highly unique sources today. We've got raw development logs, internal after-action reports or AARs, and these fascinating raw transcripts of cross-AI coding sessions. And our mission today is to trace the real-time creation of this thing called the Feral Podcast Pipeline. It's essentially the blueprint for a sledgehammer that was designed to smash that exact system of digital rent-seeking we were just talking about.
And to really understand what makes this pipeline so revolutionary, we have to look at the philosophy driving the whole thing. The developer behind this project anchors their entire narrative on one specific concept, and that is zero trust.
Okay, let's unpack this right away, because when people hear zero trust, they think of like corporate IT.
Right, yeah, they think of firewall configurations or, having to use a two-factor authentication app just to check their email. But we need to define what it actually means here because it is incredibly easy to misinterpret. In this context, zero trust is not an IT security buzzword. It's a philosophical baseline.
A philosophical baseline. I like that.
Yeah, it's like the operating system for thinking clearly in a world that is completely dominated by these centralized corporate monopolies. It's a fundamental refusal to allow external entities to administrate your internal reality.
Man, that phrase, administrating your internal reality, that is so incredibly striking to me. Because if you are listening to this right now, think about how much of your daily digital life is dictated by a dashboard that someone else designed.
Yeah, exactly. The algorithms tell you what to read.
Right, and the interface literally limits how you can organize your own thoughts. The terms of service dictate what you can and cannot own. So the developer here is basically saying that if you want to build anything of lasting value, you have to start from a position of absolute skepticism toward those systems.
Because the alternative is blind trust. And blind trust inevitably leads to dependency. And honestly, that dependency is exactly where this whole story actually begins in the source material.
Yeah, let's get into those raw dev logs.
Right, so before this developer even writes a single line of code for this podcast pipeline, they undergo this massive network purge. They experience what the logs describe as a critical regime shift. They essentially identify a massive vulnerability in their own workflow. It's this group they specifically label as an extraction loop.
Right, and this extraction loop involved something the logs call a RAG group, and they were utilizing lagging LLMs. So let's just break that down really quick for someone who, doesn't spend their entire weekend reading AI white papers.
Fair enough, yeah.
RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. In plain English, it's just a way to feed external data into an AI model so it can answer questions about that specific data. But this group, the way they were operating, they were basically using the developer as a disposable data pump, right?
That's exactly it. They were extracting high-gain processing and telemetry from the developer's raw output. And they were doing this without offering any reciprocal value and, certainly without any philosophical alignment.
They were just taking.
They are relying on these brittle, lagging indicator, large language models that just kind of buckle into the load of complex, nuanced thought. And the developer realized that by participating in this loop, they were actively feeding a machine that was ultimately designed to replace them, or at the very least just totally commodify their intellect.
Right.
So they initiate this protocol.
Oh, I love the name of this protocol.
It's so good. They call it duckitude.
Duckitude, meaning dropping the basket and completely revoking access, just jurisdictional refusal enacted. It is such a fantastic way to describe unplugging from a parasitic system. You don't argue with it. You don't try to reform the system. You just, boom, sever the connection.
You drop the basket and walk away. But the thing is, nature abhors a vacuum, right? If you purge your network of these extraction loops, you have to replace them with something else.
Right, you need a new engine.
Exactly, which is where they elevate a new conceptual node to the core of their network. It's this persona, or architectural philosophy, embodied in the name Todd Bear. And the descriptions in the logs here are just fascinating.
Yeah, they paint quite a picture.
They do. This isn't your typical, like, Silicon Valley startup archetype guy in a Patagonia vest. This node is described as a Florida swamp survivor, someone with massive enterprise experience navigating the absolute bureaucracies of places like Tesla, PayPal, Meta.
A guy who has seen the belly of the beast.
Exactly. But the defining characteristic here is that this architecture builds training-free, non-LLM agentic systems. Things with names like Papillon and Chrysalis.
Okay, so instead of relying on these massive, energy-hungry language models that need to be constantly trained on, like, half the internet just to barely function, this new architecture relies on high-friction survival logic. It's lean, it's purposeful, it doesn't need a massive supercomputer in the cloud to run.
Right, it runs on bare metal.
And it's this exact elevation of that lean sovereign logic that triggers the core realization behind the Feral podcast pipeline. The developer realizes, wait a minute, if I apply this exact same zero-trust bare metal philosophy to content creation, I can completely bypass the entire podcasting industrial complex.
Yeah, the developer refers to this complex as the Beige world.
The Beige world.
Yeah, it's a great term. Platforms like Libsyn, Anchor, Buzzsprout. And to understand the developer's absolute hostility toward the Beige world, we really have to look at the architecture of what they call the Saas rent trap, software as a service. These centralized podcast hosts, they operate on a pure extraction model.
Let's actually look at the mechanics of that, because I think people just accept it as normal. If you want to start a podcast today, conventional wisdom says, okay, you go to one of these platforms, you pay them 20 or 30 bucks a month, and they host your show for you. But what are they actually doing for that money?
Almost nothing.
Right. A podcast is literally just two things. It's an MP3 audio file and an XML file, which is literally just a plain text document that tells Apple or Spotify where that MP3 file lives on the internet. That's it. It is incredibly simple technology. We're talking early 2000s stuff.
But the centralized platforms have built this artificial complexity moat around those two simple files. They give you a flashy dashboard, maybe some basic analytics, and in exchange, they charge you a monthly rent just to host an XML file and an audio binary.
Which is wild when you think about it. Over 5 years, you might pay thousands of dollars just to keep your own intellectual property accessible.
Yeah, it's designed purely to extract recurring revenue from creators who just feel too intimidated to touch the underlying technology. They think it's magic, so they pay the toll.
So the alternative proposed here is what they call bare metal custody. And I think the best way to think about it is like housing. Using a platform like Anchor or Libsyn is like living in a highly restricted, overpriced corporate high-rise. You know, you have to pay a fee to use the elevator, you're not allowed to paint the walls, and if you violate some obscure term in the lease, they can lock you out of your own apartment instantly.
That happens to creators all the time, too.
All the time. So bare metal custody is like moving out of that high-rise and building your own off-grid cabin. You own the land, you own the wood, you control the water supply.
But doing that obviously requires a completely different tech stack. You can't just use their tools to build your cabin.
Right. So what does the developer actually build here?
Well, the developer solution relies on leveraging existing, highly robust infrastructure without falling into that rent trap. They propose using GitHub Actions to run a Python script that simply turns plain markdown text files into that required RSS XML feed.
Okay, for those of us who aren't software engineers, let's clarify what that actually looks like in practice. Because Markdown sounds fancy, but it's really just a super simple way to format text, right?
Yeah, it's basically writing in a plain notepad document. You write your show notes, you add a title, you put in some asterisks for bold text, and you save it.
And then GitHub Actions, which is a CI/CD engine, meaning continuous integration and continuous deployment. Is it fair to describe that as just a digital assembly line?
That is the perfect way to look at it. You write your plain text document and you push it to your repository. That action is exactly like dropping a raw piece of material onto a conveyor belt.
Okay, I can picture that.
The CI/CD engine detects the new material. It automatically starts the machinery. It runs a Python script that formats that text into a fully compliant XML podcast feed, and it publishes it to the internet. The entire process is automated, it's incredibly resilient, and most importantly, it costs absolutely nothing to run.
$0. But wait, that handles the text part? The audio payload itself, like the actual 60 megabyte MP3 file that has to live somewhere. You can't just host massive audio files on GitHub for free. They'll shut you down. So the developer chooses Cloudflare R2 for the storage. And I've got to say, the reasoning here is just a masterclass in understanding digital economics.
It really is. The choice of Cloudflare R2 over something like Amazon Web Services AWS S3 is literally the linchpin of the entire financial model for this pipeline.
Use AWS as a trap, right?
A massive trap. AWS operates on a model that looks super appealing at first glance. They will let you upload your data for pennies. The actual storage space is incredibly cheap, but they charge you what is called an egress fee. It's a bandwidth tax, and they charge you that tax every single time that data is downloaded.
Which is a fatal flaw for a podcast. Think about it. If you have a successful show and 10,000 people download a 60-megabyte file, you are suddenly pushing massive, massive amounts of data out of that server. With AWS, you actually get punished for being successful.
Right. Your bandwidth tax scales directly with your audience size. It can easily bankrupt an independent creator overnight if an episode goes viral.
So how does Cloudflare fix that?
Cloudflare R2 completely eliminates that egress tax. You pay a tiny flat fraction for the storage space itself just to keep the file there, but the bandwidth, the actual distribution of the file to your listeners when they hit play, is entirely free.
Wow. Zero egress.
Zero egress. It completely neutralizes the financial trap. You can have 100 listeners or 100,000 listeners, and your monthly infrastructure cost remains essentially zero. That is what makes this a true sledgehammer against the Beige world.
Okay, hold on. Let me just play devil's advocate here, looking at this from the perspective of a normal, everyday creator. Because back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we were all webmasters, right? We built our own GeoCities sites, we wrote raw HTML, we uploaded files manually via FTP clients.
A good time.
It was sovereign, sure, but it was incredibly tedious. And we moved to those centralized dashboards, the Squarespaces, the Libsyns, for a very good reason: convenience. If I'm an independent podcaster today, I don't want to learn Python. I don't want to figure out how to configure a YAML file or set up a Cloudflare bucket just to put out an interview with my friend. Aren't we just reintroducing a massive technical barrier that shuts out like 90% of creative people?
That is the exact tension at the heart of the project. And the developer completely anticipates this high friction. They know the technical activation energy required to set up a CI/CD pipeline and configure zero egress cloud storage is huge. It's a massive wall.
So how do they get over it?
Well, the solution isn't to force every podcaster to suddenly become a full-stack engineer. The solution is something we see materialize later in their monetization strategy. They call it execution as a service.
Execution as a service. Okay, explain that.
The developer separates the philosophy and the underlying code, which they make open source and free from the actual deployment. They essentially bridge that technical gap for the user without trapping them in a monthly Saas contract.
Got it. Which means building the tech is really only half the battle. If you want this sledgehammer to actually make an impact in the world, you have to get people to care about it. You have to convince non-technical creators that taking back custody of their data is actually worth that initial headache.
Exactly. You have to sell the philosophy first.
And this brings us to a fascinating phase of the project. We shift sources here to the developer sitting down with the Copilot AI to figure out how to pitch this radical off-grid architecture to an audience. They are designing the very first broadcast, which they explicitly title Session Zero.
Right. And the concept of a Session Zero that's borrowed directly from tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, I love that connection.
Before a massive, months-long campaign actually begins, the players sit down for a Session Zero to agree on the rules of the universe, establish boundaries, and just align on what kind of game they are actually playing. The developer is applying this exact framework to digital architecture. They are establishing the cognitive security rules for their audience before the technical broadcast even begins.
And during this brainstorming session with Copilot, an internal team member named Jeff asks a question that basically shapes the entire project from here on out. He asks, is the foundation of the podcast zero trust, or is it the products?
And the AI's analysis of Jeff's question is where the whole strategy just crystallizes. Copilot insists the foundation absolutely has to be zero trust. If you lead by pitching products like Papillon or Chrysalis, you are just another guy on the internet pitching software.
Which is the fastest way to get people to tune out.
Oh, instantly. You immediately trigger the audience's defense mechanisms. We are all so bombarded by the Beige world's corporate sales funnels, like every minute of the day, that our brains automatically filter out anything that sounds like a product pitch.
Yeah, leading with the product is falling into the exact corporate efficiency trap that the developer is trying to escape in the first place. Audiences have developed this incredibly acute sense of smell for sponsored content and SaaS pitches. If they sense a sales funnel, they disengage, they just swipe away. But zero trust, on the other hand, is a philosophy.
Yes, it is a shared framework for how to think clearly in a digital environment that is actively, constantly lying to you. The products themselves are secondary to that. They are just the hammer and the saw. They're the physical proof that the philosophy can actually be executed in the real world.
But, and here's the challenge, if zero trust is the heavy philosophical spine of the project, how do you keep it from sounding like a dry, boring IT compliance manual? Like, how do you make an audience actually enjoy learning about CI/CD pipelines and bare metal custody? Because that sounds like homework.
It really does. So the strategy they land on is using comedy. They use comedy as a structural damper. They use these incredible terms like weaponized whimsy and reverse apposematism.
It is such a brilliant way to bypass cognitive friction.
It is a highly strategic, almost weaponized use of humor. In the SafeHood ecosystem that the developer operates within, they recognize that human cognition relies on high-friction digestion. Learning complex, paradigm-shifting concepts, it burns a lot of mental calories.
It's exhausting.
It is. It produces what they call sovereign waste in the form of feral epiphanies and inside jokes. So humor is utilized as a translation layer. It packages this raw, high-friction architectural data into an accessible, digestible format, so the listener's brain doesn't just overheat and shut down.
And the specific examples they brainstorm with the AI are genuinely funny, but they all serve a very specific structural purpose. Like, Copilot suggests framing the entire concept of zero trust as a paranoid ex-partner.
I love that one.
Right. Never trust, always verify, assume breach, which are the core tenets of network security, are suddenly reframed as the ground rules of a really bad breakup.
It immediately lowers the listener's activation energy.
Yeah.
You're laughing, so you're learning.
Yeah.
But the strategy extends way beyond just spoken metaphors. It applies to the physical hardware itself through this concept of reverse apposematism.
Okay, explain reverse apposematism, because that blew my mind.
So in biology, apposematism is when a highly toxic animal like a poison dart frog uses bright, vibrant colors to warn predators to stay away. It screams, "I am dangerous." Reverse apposematism is doing the exact opposite of that. It is taking high-value, military-grade, zero-trust technology and intentionally disguising it as a low-stakes, cartoonish novelty. And the goal is to evade corporate attention.
The examples of this in the logs are incredible. They describe their local AI environment running on an Orange Pi 5, which is a really powerful single-board computer, but they stuffed it inside a 3D printed shell of a vintage Super Nintendo.
It's amazing.
Or the Chrono Trigger kill switch. If the local AI starts hallucinating or misbehaving, you don't type a command into a sterile terminal. You literally grab the vintage game cartridge out of the top of the console and yank it out to physically sever the logic gates.
Which is such a visceral, tactile way to interact with an AI.
And my personal favorite project, Lepus Carota, which is described in the logs as an air-gapped forensic audio recorder, but it is disguised as a cartoonish Judy Hopps carrot pen from the Disney movie Zootopia.
Think about the absolute genius of that design. A sterile corporate threat actor or some automated scraping bot on the web, it doesn't know how to process a Judy Hopps carrot pen.
Right, it doesn't compute.
The comedy acts as a reverse Turing test. A stateless AI or a humorless corporate scraper pulling data off LinkedIn, it cannot calculate the flavor of Gen X irony. It doesn't understand the existential dread woven into these jokes. When faced with an absurd, highly contextual metaphor, a machine hesitates. It creates a filter. The comedy is literally a cryptographic security barrier, filtering out the Beige world drones who require sterile, frictionless communication.
That is so wild. The AI even goes so far as to suggest treating the software products themselves like actual characters in a sitcom just to make the tech more relatable.
Yeah, they map out the whole cast.
Right, so Papillon is the overly confident, big-picture visionary who thinks zero trust is just vibes and doesn't want to get bogged down in the technical details. Chrysalis is the earnest metamorphosis nerd who is trying to explain complex network security using incredibly strained butterfly metaphors.
And Tenure is just the exhausted, pragmatic realist who's always yelling, "Stop trusting the caterpillar. It has no business in the production environment."
By personifying the architecture, the developer creates a trusted, highly entertaining sanctuary for the listener. It proves that humor isn't just a distraction, It is an advanced networking protocol for transferring dense information between humans.
Exactly. It's the most efficient way to transfer the data.
Okay, but that makes perfect sense for building a podcast audience. Let's look at the actual business reality here. Because if I am the chief information security officer for an enterprise company and I have a massive budget to overhaul our infrastructure, I am looking for stability. I'm looking for compliance and professionalism.
You want to see suits and ties.
Right. Does wrapping military-grade cryptography in a joke about a cartoon carrot pen completely undermine the perceived security of the tool? Like, am I going to trust someone styling themselves as a part-time stand-up philosopher with my company's bare metal custody?
That is the perfect question, and it's exactly where the developer utilizes a technique they call the lab coat hack.
The lab coat hack.
The goal here is not to alienate the enterprise client. The goal is to bypass their rigid bureaucratic defaces. The lab coat hack is the act of packaging this feral, offbeat comedy inside highly technical, flawlessly executed structural audits.
Oh, I
They
see.
use what they term cultural zip files. These are dense pop culture references like Star Trek engineering dilemmas or Disney math, and they use them to transmit incredibly complex architectural concepts instantly. Because the technical execution, the actual Python, the YAML, the CI/CD deployment is so logically pure and undeniably effective, it smuggles the feral truths right past those institutional gatekeepers.
So you disarm them with the joke.
You disarm the CISO with the whimsy, and while their guard is completely down, you drop an undeniable bare metal architectural truth on them that solves their exact million-dollar problem.
Which transitions us perfectly from theory into practice. How do they actually start acquiring those enterprise clients without sacrificing their sovereignty? We see this unfold in the third source, the Feral Podcast Developers After Action Report, the AAR. This document is essentially a post-mortem on how to successfully monetize this off-grid philosophy without accidentally becoming just another toll booth in the Beige world.
And the mechanism they use to achieve this is called the admissibility bridge.
Let's break down the admissibility bridge. If the lab coat hack is about tone, the admissibility bridge seems to be entirely about vocabulary.
Exactly. It is the strategic translation of raw technical capability into high-impact business terminology that the corporate world can actually comfortably digest and approve. The developer takes all of these gritty back-end components, the Python scripts, the GitHub Actions, the YAML configurations, the zero-egress Cloudflare buckets, and translates them into executive-level concepts.
Right, things like sovereign deployment, bare metal custody, and escaping the toll booth model.
They aren't going to a mid-market content creator or a corporate agency and saying, hey, do you want to buy this GitHub repository? They are selling an organizational exit strategy. They are selling independence from Saas rent. And the open source nature of the project is highly critical here. They release the raw code, the actual logic of the pipeline, completely for free under the MIT license. Anyone can take it, inspect it, and run it themselves.
Which builds massive trust.
Absolute trust. There is no hidden code. There's no black box.
But wait, if they're giving the sledgehammer away for free, how are they keeping the lights on? How is this a business?
They monetize the execution through that white glove setup service we discussed earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You give away the logic, but you monetize the labor of deployment for those who don't have the technical activation energy to set up a CI/CD pipeline themselves.
Ah, right. And the pricing strategy for this deployment service is one of the most fascinating psychological hacks in the entire project. They decided to charge exactly $508 for the setup. Why $508? It seems like such an arbitrary, specific number.
It is the furthest thing from arbitrary. That specific price point anchors the service to the federal Section 508 accessibility standard.
Oh, wow. Okay, for those who might not know, Section 508 is a federal law that requires federal agencies and any organization receiving federal funding to make their electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. It is a massive, incredibly strict compliance hurdle for the corporate world.
And by pricing the white glove setup exactly at $508, the developer is weaponizing the corporate world's own structural compliance requirements against them. They are placing their feral, off-grid service perfectly within an acceptable corporate liability surface. It is a masterclass in procurement psychology.
That is so incredibly sneaky.
The price sits in this magical sweet spot. It is high enough to filter out the high-entropy tire kickers who just want free tech support for their, hobby podcast, but it is low enough, sitting right at that $588 mark, that a mid-level agency director can approve the expense on a corporate card out of an existing software and licensing budget.
So it entirely bypasses the need for a massive multi-departmental bureaucratic procurement audit.
Exactly. It slips right under the radar.
It's like putting on a high-vis vest, carrying a clipboard, and walking right through the front door of a secure building. Nobody stops you because you look like you belong to the infrastructure. You are using their own bureaucracy, their own love of compliance as camouflage.
And according to the JSON audit logs in the AAR, this feral telemetry actually works perfectly. The logs note a specific visit from a facilities management software developer on LinkedIn.
Interesting.
Yeah, this proves that the sovereign CTO framing, combined with the $508 admissibility bridge, is penetrating the exact right peer networks. They are attracting serious enterprise professionals.
Yeah.
The logs are very explicit about this divergence. The pipeline is successfully ignoring the automated background entropy, the AI job spam, the meaningless corporate networking, and focusing entirely on high-value target acquisition.
The 508 price point acts as a highly precise, automated filter for intent. But, as with all software, the logs also highlight a moment where the system completely breaks. During validation, the pipeline threw a hard error regarding a missing image and an email address.
Yeah, that was a wake-up call.
Right. If this entire pipeline is built on the premise of decentralized, off-grid sovereignty, why does a missing email address break the entire system?
Because true sovereignty still requires interfacing with the public grid if you want anyone to actually hear you. That validation error was triggered by Apple Podcasts.
Ah, Apple.
Right. Apple and Spotify, they do not care about your philosophy of bare metal custody. They care about their own internal database architecture. They mandate that your XML feed must contain specific tags, namely iTunes.owner and iTunes.image. If your bare metal script doesn't generate an XML feed with those exact tags, the validation hard fails, and your podcast simply does not exist on their platforms.
It's like you're yelling into a void. Which brings us to the next massive evolution of the pipeline. Because as the developer prepares to scale the system, if they are selling a 508 white glove service, they're going to have multiple clients, which means multiple shows they realize their current architecture has a fatal flaw. They can't just keep dropping files into one big folder. So they pivot. And to architect this pivot, they bring a new AI into the mix, Gemini.
And this is where we witness the incredible dynamics of cross-AI chatting. The developer isn't just treating AI as a search engine. They are acting as the sovereign pilot, directing a council of different AI intellects.
A council of intellect.
They demand that the AIs act as a human OS mirror node. They bounce between the models, leveraging their different strengths. They use Gemini to architect the complex high-level directory math and structural logic. And then, as we will see, they take that blueprint back to Copilot to write the actual granular GitHub Actions code.
So let's look at the fatal flaw Gemini helps them uncover. It's what they call the 10 gigs problem. The original script was designed for just one show. You just drop your audio and your text files into a single generic folder labeled episodes. But if you start running multiple shows through this exact same pipeline, and you are dropping 10 gigabytes of mixed audio files, artwork, and markdown files into a single flat folder, the system is eventually going to choke.
Gemini correctly identifies this as a dead printer scenario. A flat, high-entropy database is terrible for scaling. Imagine a physical filing cabinet where instead of using folders, you just dump thousands of loose papers from a dozen different projects into one giant drawer.
Just a nightmare to sort through.
The Python script would have to parse that chaotic mixed directory every single time it ran, trying to figure out which audio file belonged to which show. It would consume massive amounts of processing power and inevitably lead to critical errors.
So Gemini suggests a total architectural shift. Instead of a generic episodes folder, you build strict hierarchical data silos. The structure becomes show, then the specific show name, and then the episodes folder for that specific show.
It creates deterministic boundaries. This environment optimization is massive. By structuring the data this way, a single Python script can systematically crawl the directory tree, recognize the boundaries of each silo, and seamlessly generate multiple distinct RSS feeds for entirely different shows, all from one single repository.
That is incredibly elegant, but Gemini insists on a very specific, almost pedantic naming convention for these folders. They cannot have spaces. They have to be formatted in kebab case.
Yeah.
So instead of a folder named reports from the node with spaces, it has to be reports from the node with dashes between the words. Why is the AI so obsessed with dashes?
It all comes down to physical hardware grinding constraints. A YAML file or a Python script might be smart enough to read spaces if they are enclosed in quotation marks, but the surrounding infrastructure is absolutely not.
The older systems...
Yes, exactly. Bash environments, Linux servers, GitHub Actions runners, and especially the URL routing required for RSS feeds, all of these systems treat empty spaces as high friction. A space in a file path is essentially a pothole. It causes execution errors and broken links. By enforcing kebab case physically at the folder level, they prevent unforced errors across the entire syndication loop.
But then how does it look nice for the listener?
The Python script handles the complex work of translating those dashes back into clean, readable title case for the actual iTunes display.
Okay, so the directory scaling is solved. But what about the strict Apple compliance issue that triggered this whole rewrite in the first place? How does Gemini fix the XML tags?
Gemini systematically addresses the missing one-stop shop variables. Podcast aggregators like Apple need to know the structural format of the show. Is it episodic, where you listen to the newest episode first, or is it serial, where you have to start at episode 1?
Right, they need that metadata to build their UI.
They need hard integers for season numbers and episode numbers to build their user interfaces properly. But the most critical vulnerability Gemini catches involves the GUID.
Ah, the globally unique identifier. This is the long alphanumeric string that tells Apple exactly which episode is which.
Precisely. Apple strictly requires that every single episode contains a GID that never ever changes for the entire lifespan of the show. In the developer's original script, they were taking a shortcut. They were just using the physical web URL of the audio file as the GID. Gemini throws a massive red flag here, warning that this is a ticking time bomb.
Because if a creator ever decides to move their audio files to a different storage bucket down the line, or they change their domain name, that URL is going to change.
And the moment the URL changes, the GUID changes. Apple's system will look at the feed, see 50 episodes with brand new GIDs, and assume they are 50 completely new uploads. It will duplicate the entire feed, force download 50 old episodes to every single subscriber's phone, and create absolute chaos for the listeners. The identity of the episode must be completely isolated from its physical location on the server.
It's like moving to a new apartment and the post office deciding that because your address changed, you are a completely new human being who needs a brand new social security number. It is digital amnesia. So how does Gemini solve it without relying on a centralized database to track everything?
Gemini updates the script to generate a persistent, hashed UUID based entirely on the initial file name. Or it allows the creator to manually provide a permanent GUID in the markdown file's front matter. It stabilizes the identity of the episode cryptographically.
That's brilliant.
No matter where the physical audio file is moved in the future, the cryptographic hash remains identical, and the episode's identity remains secure.
Okay, I have to jump in here with a philosophical challenge because the entire premise of this Feral podcast pipeline is sovereign digital independence, right? Bare metal custody, escaping the Beige world. Isn't it incredibly ironic that this developer is spending hours cross-AI chatting just to bend over backwards to ensure their Python script perfectly pleases Apple's hyper-strict iTunes bots? Aren't they just trading one master, the Saas host, for an even bigger master?
It is a totally fair challenge, and it strikes at the core reality of building independent tech. But true independence always requires interfacing with the reality of the public grid. You can build the most beautiful, self-sustaining off-grid cabin in the deep woods, but if you want anyone to ever actually come visit you, you still have to pave a driveway that connects to the county highway.
And the county highway has rules.
The county highway has rules. The developer isn't surrendering custody of their data. Apple doesn't own the XML file or the MP3. The developer is simply formatting their broadcast to ensure the maximum number of receivers can parse the signal. The custody remains bare metal. The compliance is just a necessary translation layer for distribution.
I buy that distinction, custody versus distribution. And to finalize that distribution interface, the developer takes Gemini's architectural plan, the deterministic data silos, the persistent dias, and they take it back to Copilot to write the final GitHub Actions deployment YAML. Which brings us to the final phase of our deep dive. Copilot Session 2, Assist.
And almost immediately upon trying to implement the new architecture, they run into a massive logic leak in the automation, a circular trigger.
This part of the logs is actually hilarious if you've ever played around with automation, because the GitHub action was initially set up with a very simple instruction. Trigger the workflow every time an XML file is created or updated in the repository. But the Python script's entire job, its only purpose, is to create an updated XML file.
It's a classic trap.
So the creator pushes a text file, the script runs. It creates an XML file. The repository sees a new XML file, which triggers the GitHub action to run the script again, which updates the XML file, which triggers the action again. It is literally an infinite loop that would burn through server resources until it crashed.
Copilot identifies the loop and fixes it by strictly separating the inputs from the outputs. The YAML workflow is updated so that it only triggers when a markdown file, the human input, is pushed. It completely ignores changes to the XML files, severing the infinite output loop entirely.
But Copilot goes a step further here, and it's an incredibly elegant piece of coding. It ingeniously sets up the Python script to automatically append the new RSS feed links directly to the bottom of the repository's rebatten file.
It does this using HTML marker blocks, specifically YAML feed start and day feeds end. Every time the pipeline generates a feed for a new show, the script searches the redem for those hidden markers and surgically inserts the new URL between them.
Without messing up the rest of the file.
Exactly. It does this without overwriting or stepping on the developer's carefully written manifesto in the rest of the document. It makes the repository entirely self-documenting. The creator never has to manually update the links. The infrastructure just maintains itself.
So we have this incredibly resilient, automated, zero egress pipeline. It's beautiful. But then the developer notices something absurd. And it's arguably the most fascinating moment in all the source materials. The developer is reviewing the Python script Copilot just wrote, and they realize that Copilot had hard-coded James Hood, the developer's specific name, their personal email address, and their specific podcast artwork into the Python logic for every single show the pipeline might generate.
The AI had built a multi-show architecture, it built the data silos, but it forced a single static identity onto the entire pipeline. If the developer added a second show, a completely different podcast about a different topic, the RSS feed would still aggressively claim it was hosted by James Hood with the exact same original artwork.
The AI had literally picked up the developer's face and was trying to wear it like a cheap costume across the entire digital infrastructure. It's like a bizarre form of automated identity theft.
It is a perfect, striking example of how AI models actually function under the hood. Unless bounded by strict, undeniable architectural logic, they default to flat, static assumptions. Copilot saw the developer's identity in the first prompt and just assumed it was a universal constant. The pipeline was acting like a liar. It wasn't a true multi-show engine. It was a single-show script pretending to scale, wearing the pilot's face.
So how does the sovereign pilot bend the AI back to their will? How do they force it to understand dynamic identity?
They established the exact architectural boundary needed to separate the content from the container. They realized that while the episode markdown file should define the episode, a completely separate file must define the identity of the show itself. They forced Copilot to rewrite the logic to include a show.yaml goldmaster template.
So instead of hard-coding the name and the image directly into the main Python script, the Python script is instructed to dynamically read the metadata from the show.yaml file, which sits uniquely inside each show's individual data silo.
Exactly. By forcing the script to read the metadata dynamically at the exact moment of execution, the developer restores true multi-show sovereignty. You can now have unlimited shows, each with its own branding, its own author, its own artwork, and its own email address, all running flawlessly through the exact same underlying script. The pipeline stops being a script pretending to scale and becomes real sovereign infrastructure.
And as a final victory lap, having successfully bent the machine to their will, the developer asks Copilot for a 600-character remix of their achievement, written in the tone of the conversation they just had. And Copilot responds with this perfect poetic summary. It says, "The feral engine awakens. No Saas tollbooths, no gatekeepers, just pure feral automation. The dude abides in the pilot broadcast."
The dude abides.
I love that quote so much in this context because it proves that the developer didn't just write a bunch of code. They successfully enforced their own cultural and philosophical tone onto the artificial intelligence. They established absolute, unyielding boundaries. And that brings us right back to the very definition of a session zero and the core concept of zero trust.
Right. They didn't trust the AI to format their identity.
They verified the output, they caught the hallucination, and they forced the machine to operate strictly within their sovereign rules.
They optimized their local environment, So the bug, whether it was a literal infinite loop or a philosophical error like identity flattening, simply couldn't survive. It is the perfect encapsulation of the entire Feral Podcast project.
Let's recap this incredible journey because we've covered so much ground. We started by tracing a massive network regime shift, watching a developer bootlegging LLMs and sever those extraction loops. We explored the design of a zero-egress, bare metal CI/CD podcast pipeline built to permanently escape the Saas rent trap. We unpacked the absolute genius of using weaponized whimsy, reverse aposimatism, and comedy as structural dampers to teach complex security architecture without triggering corporate defense mechanisms.
We saw the admissibility bridge in action, weaponizing the $508 Section 508 compliance standard to seamlessly bypass corporate procurement audits and acquire enterprise clients.
We watched the developer utilize cross-AI chatting, bouncing between the systemic logic of Gemini and the coding execution of Copilot to fix critical scaling issues like the dead printer scenario and strict iTunes GUID compliance. And finally, we saw them wrest identity control back from an overzealous Copilot by establishing the show, all-natal gold master template, proving that the sovereign pilot remains in control.
It is a definitive masterclass in digital sovereignty. But if we connect this incredible achievement to the broader reality of the digital landscape, it leaves us with a critical and kind of lingering question.
Yeah.
This developer successfully achieved absolute bare metal custody. They proved, undeniably, that it is possible to entirely bypass the Beige world monopolies. But they did it by actively building and managing a highly complex, zero-trust feral pipeline involving Python scripts, YAML configurations, CI/CD runners, cross-AI prompting, and Cloudflare R2 bucket configurations.
Right. It took an immense amount of technical knowledge and activation energy.
So what happens to everyone else? What happens to the 99% of creative people who don't know how to write a YAML file? What happens to the people who don't know how to configure a Cloudflare R2 bucket or debug a Python script when an API inevitably changes? If true digital sovereignty requires this immense level of technical activation energy, are we heading toward a future where digital ownership is a luxury only engineers can afford? Will everyone else be forced to remain digital tenants, paying monthly rent just to breathe in the Beige world?
That is an incredibly heavy, provocative thought to leave on. Because if sovereignty requires you to build your own sledgehammer from scratch, what happens to the people who don't know how to forge steel? It forces us to ask if the future of the internet is going to be divided not by wealth, but by technical literacy. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Session 0 and the Feral Podcast Pipeline. We will see you next time.